The steady beep of the heart monitor punctuated the heavy silence of the hospital room. I watched my husband's chest rise and fall with labored breaths, his once vibrant face now hollow and ashen against the sterile white pillowcase. The doctors had given him days, maybe hours. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. Aggressive, merciless, terminal, just like mine had been. 5 years ago, when the roles were reversed, and I was the one withering away in a hospital bed, he hadn't stood vigil like I was doing now. No, Richard had packed his bags while I was at my second round of chemotherapy, leaving nothing but a handwritten note on our kitchen counter. "I can't watch you die," it had read. "I'm not strong enough for this. I'm sorry." 7 years of marriage dissolved in 9 pitiful words. I smoothed my black dress. Funeral attire seemed appropriate, though the funeral hadn't happened yet, and leaned forward in the uncomfortable visitor's chair. Richard's eyes fluttered open, cloudy with morphine but still registering my presence. "Emma," he whispered, his voice like sandpaper. "You're still here." I smiled, the expression not quite reaching my eyes. "Yes, Richard. I'm still here." "Unlike you?" His gaunt face twisted in confusion, then shame. Even now, even after everything, he expected forgiveness. That's how it had always been with Richard. He made mistakes, I forgave him. He forgot anniversaries, I forgave him. He abandoned me to die alone, and he expected— what? That I'd absolve him at the 11th hour? Not this time. "I need to tell you something," I said softly, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions inside me. I leaned closer, my lips nearly brushing his ear. "I've been cancer-free for 4 years. I pulled back to see the impact of my words. His eyes widened, confusion giving way to disbelief, then understanding. "I waited for you to come back," I continued. "Every day during treatment, every session of chemo, every night I spent vomiting until there was nothing left but blood and bile. I waited. And you never came." A tear slid down his hollow cheek. "Good." I wanted him to cry. I wanted him to feel a fraction of the pain I had endured. But I survived. Without you? And when I went into remission, I had a choice to make. I smoothed his thin hair back from his forehead in a mockery of tenderness. "I could have told you then. I could have moved on. But I decided you deserve to know what it feels like when someone who promised to love you, in sickness and in health, only meant the health part." Richard tried to speak but only managed a weak cough. I didn't help him reach for the water. I just watched, the way he had never watched me suffer. So I waited again, patiently, for years. And now here we are. I gestured to the room, the machines keeping him alive. Isn't it funny how life works out? It wasn't funny, none of it was funny, but the bitter laugh escaped my lips anyway. This is the story of how my husband abandoned me when I needed him most, and how I made sure he understood exactly what that felt like before he took his last breath. It's not a story I'm proud of, but it's mine, and after carrying it silently for so long, I need to tell it. The diagnosis came on an ordinary Tuesday. Spring was just beginning to stir. Tiny buds dotted the branches outside our bedroom window, promising life and renewal even as mine was being threatened. I'd been feeling fatigued for months, dismissing it as stress from my job teaching 2nd grade. The bruising I'd attributed to clumsiness, the weight loss to an improved diet. But when I nearly collapsed while writing spelling words on the blackboard, the school nurse insisted I see a doctor. A battery of tests later, the words, "acute myeloid leukemia," hung in the sterile air of the consultation room. "It's aggressive, Dr. Mitchell had said, her kind eyes holding mine, "but treatable. We need to start chemotherapy immediately." Richard sat beside me, his hand clutching mine so tightly it hurt. In those first moments, he was everything I needed, steady, supportive, present. He asked intelligent questions about treatment protocols and success rates while I sat in stunned silence, the word cancer echoing in my mind like a death knell. "We'll beat this," he whispered as we drove home, his voice cracking slightly. "You're strong, Emma. We're strong together." I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. The first round of chemo was brutal, but bearable with Richard by my side. He drove me to appointments, held back my hair when I vomited, researched alternative therapies late into the night. He became my advocate, my caregiver, my rock. When my hair started falling out in clumps, he shaved my head in our bathroom, kissing my bare scalp with tears in his eyes. "Still beautiful," he'd murmured. "Always beautiful." 3 weeks into treatment, the subtle shift began. Richard started coming to fewer appointments, claiming work couldn't spare him. He slept in the guest room, saying he didn't want to disturb my rest. He grew quieter during our dinners, his eyes distant, focusing on points beyond my shoulder rather than meeting my gaze. I understood. Cancer doesn't just happen to the patient, it happens to everyone who loves them. Richard was watching his vibrant, healthy wife transform into a skeletal, vomiting stranger. Of course it was hard for him. I tried to be understanding, to not demand too much, to put on a brave face when he was home. "You don't have to pretend for me," I told him one evening, reaching for his hand across our kitchen table. "It's okay to be scared. I'm scared too." He nodded, squeezed my fingers, but his eyes remained fixed on his untouched dinner. Looking back, I should have seen it then, not fear, but decision. He had already begun to leave me in his mind. The day he actually left, I had my second round of chemo scheduled. He'd promised to drive me, but when I woke that morning, his side of the bed was empty. Not unusual. He'd been rising early, avoiding the awkward morning moments of helping me to the bathroom when I was too weak to walk alone. I called out for him as I struggled to dress myself, my fingers clumsy with neuropathy from the treatment. The house answered with silence. In the kitchen, I found the note, 3 sentences that demolished our life together. I read it once, twice, a third time, certain I was hallucinating, another side effect of the chemicals poisoning my body to save my life. But the note remained, the blue ink stark against our cream stationery. "I can't watch you die. I'm not strong enough for this. I'm sorry." My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the cold tile floor, the note clutched to my chest. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, I remembered the appointment. Cancer doesn't care if your husband leaves you. It continues its relentless invasion regardless. I called a cab. I sat alone in the infusion center, a needle in my arm dripping poison into my veins, while nurses cast sympathetic glances my way. My body was fighting for survival, but in those hours, I wasn't sure I wanted it to win. "Where's your husband today?" the cheery infusion nurse asked as she checked my IV. "He left me," I said, my voice hollow, emotionless. Saying it aloud made it real. Her face fell. "Oh, honey." She squeezed my shoulder, and that simple touch of compassion broke something in me. I began to sob, huge, racking cries that drew concerned looks from other patients. That was the first day of my new life. Patient, abandoned wife, survivor in training. I didn't know it yet, but it was also the first day of my revenge. Not that I conceptualized it as revenge then. At that moment, all I felt was pain, betrayal, and a bone-deep loneliness that seemed more terminal than the cancer itself. The days that followed blur together in my memory, a montage of sickness, tears, and desperate phone calls. I called Richard's cell repeatedly until it went straight to voicemail, suggesting he'd either turned it off or blocked my number. I called his parents, who expressed shocked dismay, but claimed they hadn't heard from him. I even called his office, only to be told by his uncomfortable assistant that he had taken an indefinite leave of absence. He had vanished as completely as if he'd died. Except I was the one supposed to be dying, and he was the one who couldn't bear to watch. My sister Diane flew in from Seattle, her face tight with fury when she saw my condition. She moved into my house and became everything Richard should have been: driver, nurse, advocate, shoulder to cry on. She contacted a lawyer who explained that abandonment during illness wouldn't expedite divorce proceedings, but would certainly influence settlements. Divorce. The word felt surreal. A month ago, we were discussing baby names for the children we'd have after I recovered. Now I was discussing division of assets with a stranger in an expensive suit while my sister held my trembling hand. "He can't just disappear," the lawyer explained gently. "Legally, financially, there are loose ends. He'll surface eventually." I nodded, not really caring about loose ends or settlements. What I wanted couldn't be granted by any court. My health restored, my marriage rewound to before that Tuesday diagnosis, my husband back beside me, keeping the promises he'd made. As the chemo continued, as my body fought its war on 2 fronts, against the cancer and against the treatment, I experienced a strange splitting of self. There was the physical me, weak, nauseated, balding, focused only on surviving until tomorrow. And there was another me, watching from somewhere distant, coldly observing my suffering and Richard's absence, calculating something I wasn't yet ready to name. 3 months into treatment, as I sat receiving my 5th round of chemotherapy, my oncologist entered the infusion room with an unexpected smile. "The cancer is responding extremely well to treatment," Dr. Mitchell said, glancing at my chart. "Your blood counts are improving significantly. If this trend continues, we might be looking at remission sooner than expected." Diane, who hadn't left my side during treatment despite my insistence that she return to her own life, squeezed my hand. "That's fantastic news, isn't it, Em?" I should have felt elation, relief, hope. Instead, I felt a strange emptiness, followed by a thought that scared me with its clarity. Richard will never know if I live or die. That night, lying in our bed, still hours in my mind, though he'd been gone for months, I allowed myself to imagine a future. Not the future we'd planned together, but something else entirely. A future where I survived and Richard believed he'd abandoned a dying woman. Richard lived with that knowledge, that guilt, that shame. The thought gave me the first real peace I'd felt since his departure. 2 more months of treatment followed, each blood test showing improvement, each bone marrow biopsy revealing fewer cancer cells. My hair began to grow back, peach fuzz at first, then a soft cap of brown that Diane said made me look like an elegant pixie. I gained weight. Color returned to my cheeks. I started taking short walks around the neighborhood, my stamina building slowly but steadily. 6 months after diagnosis, Dr. Mitchell spoke the words I desperately wanted to hear. "You're in remission, Emma," Diane cried. My parents, who had been shuttling back and forth between their home and mine throughout my illness, opened champagne. Friends who had stepped up in Richard's absence organized a small celebration. I smiled and accepted congratulations and tried to feel normal joy. But underneath, that cold, calculating part of me was awakening, stretching, planning. A week after my remission declaration, Richard's lawyer contacted mine. Richard wanted a divorce. He was living in Colorado now. He was willing to give me the house, a generous settlement, whatever I wanted. He just wanted it to be over. My lawyer advised accepting the offer. "You could fight for more," she said, "but honestly, this is quite fair. More than fair given the circumstances." I nodded, signed where indicated, accepted the settlement that effectively erased our marriage while providing me financial security through my recovery and beyond. Richard had bought his freedom, and I had sold mine for a price that seemed reasonable to everyone but me. What value do you place on a broken heart? On betrayal? On abandonment at the darkest moment of your life? There wasn't a figure high enough. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks later. I was officially Emma Caldwell again, no longer Emma Preston. Cancer-free and husband-free, beginning my second chance at life. That should have been the end of the story. Woman gets cancer, husband leaves, woman beats cancer, woman rebuilds life. Credits roll, inspirational music plays. But as I stood in the lawyer's office holding the final divorce papers, I knew it was just the beginning. Because I had made a decision during those long nights of chemo, those solitary mornings of vomiting with no one to hold back my hair, those endless afternoons of staring at my phone, willing it to ring with Richard's call. I had decided that someday, somehow, Richard would understand exactly what he had done to me. And so began the second phase of my life after Richard's abandonment. The waiting phase, the watching phase, the planning phase. I returned to teaching the following fall. My students' innocent energy healing something in me that medicine couldn't touch. I joined a cancer survivors support group, finding solace in the shared understanding of others who had stared death in the face. I reconnected with friends, took up new hobbies, started dating casually. To all outward appearances, I was moving on admirably, but privately, I maintained a connection to Richard's life through the loose threads that still bound us. His parents, guilt-ridden over their son's behavior, kept in occasional contact, sending birthday cards and Christmas wishes. Old mutual friends who couldn't bring themselves to completely cut ties with either of us provided inadvertent updates. Social media, that double-edged sword of modern life, offered glimpses through friends of friends. I learned that Richard had taken a teaching position at a small college in Boulder, that he'd bought a modest house near the mountains, that he was dating, though not seriously, that he rarely mentioned his past marriage or the wife he'd left behind to die. 1 year into remission, I had my regular follow-up scans, still clear. Dr. Mitchell was pleased, cautiously optimistic. "The longer you stay in remission, the better your prognosis," she explained. "But we'll continue monitoring closely for the next several years." As I left the hospital that day, a plan crystallized in my mind. Not fully formed yet, but taking shape. I wouldn't tell anyone about my remission except my immediate family and closest friends. To the wider world, to distant acquaintances, to Richard's remaining connections, I would remain poor Emma, battling cancer so bravely. It wasn't difficult. People don't like to ask direct questions about terminal illness. They accept vague updates, interpret ambiguous statements according to their expectations. Still fighting could mean still in treatment or still in remission. Taking it day by day applies equally to the sick and the recovered. Grateful for every moment is universal. The second year of remission passed, then the third. My hair grew long again. I was promoted to lead teacher at my school. I dated a kind man named Thomas for several months before gently ending things when he started talking about future plans. I wasn't ready, not because I still loved Richard, but because my future contained a chapter I couldn't share with anyone else. In the 4th year of my remission, Richard's mother called me out of the blue. We hadn't spoken in over a year, just exchanged occasional texts on holidays. "Emma, dear," she said, her voice strained. "I hope I'm not overstepping, but, well, Richard is sick." My heart stuttered in my chest. "Sick?" "Cancer," she said, the word falling between us like a stone. "Pancreatic. It's not good, Emma. The doctors say maybe a year with treatment." I sat down heavily on my couch, a roaring in my ears drowning out her next few sentences. Richard had cancer. Terminal cancer. After all my nebulous planning, all my vague thoughts of someday making him understand what he'd done, fate had handed me the perfect opportunity. "And I know it's asking a lot," Martha was saying when I tuned back in, "but he's been asking about you. I think he regrets, well, everything. It would mean so much if you could find it in your heart to reach out. Just a card or a call? Some kind of forgiveness before—" "I'll do better than that," I heard myself say, my voice calm despite the trembling in my hands. "I'll visit him." The silence on the other end told me this was more than she'd hoped for. "Oh, Emma, you always were too good for him. If only she knew." That night, I sat on my back porch, watching the sunset and feeling the weight of the decision I'd just made. Was I really going to do this? Use Richard's illness, his impending death, as the vehicle for my long-simmering revenge? Yes, I was. Because it wasn't about hurting Richard. Not really. It was about justice. About consequences. About making sure that before he left this world, he fully understood what he had done when he left me in mine. The next morning, I called Dr. Mitchell's office and requested copies of all my medical records, diagnosis, treatment protocols, remission confirmation, follow-up scans. Everything that documented my journey from terminal patient to survivor. "Planning to switch doctors?" the receptionist asked conversationally. "No," I replied. "Just want to have my own copies, for peace of mind." When the thick envelope arrived a week later, I sat at my kitchen table and spread out the papers chronologically, a medical autobiography in clinical terms and laboratory values. I separated out the key documents: the original pathology report confirming my leukemia, the treatment summary, the first clean bone marrow biopsy, the official remission declaration. I then called Richard's mother back and got the details of his diagnosis, his doctors, his treatment plan, information she willingly shared, grateful for my apparent compassion and interest. I researched pancreatic cancer, familiarizing myself with the terminology, the prognosis, the progression. I needed to understand exactly what he was facing, what his final months would look like. Armed with knowledge of both our cancers, I began to formulate my approach. I wouldn't rush in immediately with revelations and accusations. No, this needed to be gradual, calculated, perfectly timed. Richard needed to believe in my forgiveness first, to accept my presence as an act of mercy, before understanding it was anything but. I took a leave of absence from teaching, citing family health issues. Not entirely a lie. I sublet my house to a careful graduate student, packed 2 suitcases with practical clothes and my medical records, and flew to Colorado. Martha met me at the airport, her face a portrait of gratitude and grief. She'd aged considerably since I'd last seen her 5 years earlier, her hair completely gray now, deep lines etched around her eyes and mouth. "He doesn't know you're coming," she confessed as we drove from the airport to her home. "I was afraid he'd refuse to see you out of shame." "That's probably wise," I said softly. "How much does he know about my condition?" She glanced at me sideways. "Only what we've gathered. That you've been fighting all these years. That it's been up and down." She hesitated. "Is that accurate?" I chose my words carefully. "Cancer is a journey with many chapters. Some better than others." She nodded, accepting this non-answer, perhaps not wanting to press for details that might be painful. Little did she know that my evasiveness served a purpose beyond protecting my feelings. Martha had prepared her guest room for me, though I'd booked a hotel as well, anticipating the need for privacy as my plan unfolded. "I thought we might go see him tomorrow," she suggested as she showed me around. "He has chemo in the morning, but he's usually less fatigued in the afternoons, at least during this phase of treatment." "Perfect," I agreed. "And Martha, thank you for reaching out to me. This means more than you know." She hugged me then, this woman who might have been my mother-in-law for decades in another life. "You're a saint, Emma. After what he did, most women would never—" I returned her embrace, allowing her to interpret my rigid posture as emotional overwhelm rather than the steely resolve it actually was. "We all make mistakes," I murmured. "Some more consequential than others." That night, alone in the guest room with its floral wallpaper and family photos, carefully edited to exclude wedding pictures, I noticed, I reviewed my plan one final time. I would ingratiate myself gradually, offering friendship and support. I would allude to my ongoing cancer battle, letting Richard assume the worst without explicitly lying. I would become indispensable to his care, ensuring private time for the revelations to come. And when the end was near, when Richard had come to depend on my presence, to believe in my forgiveness, only then would I reveal the truth. That I had survived what he couldn't bear to witness, that I had lived the life he had abandoned. That his final act of leaving me to die alone would be mirrored in my final act of letting him understand exactly what he had thrown away. Sleep came surprisingly easily that night, a dreamless, peaceful rest. For the first time in years, I felt perfectly aligned with my purpose. The next morning, Martha made breakfast, an elaborate spread of pancakes, eggs, bacon, as if feeding me well might compensate for her son's sins. I ate little, my appetite diminished by anticipation rather than illness, though I let her assume the latter. "Cancer takes so much from us," she sighed, watching me push eggs around my plate. "Your appetite, your energy, your trust," I added quietly. "Your faith in permanence." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Richard was a fool," she said bluntly. "His father and I raised him better than that." I smiled sadly. Sometimes we don't know what we're capable of until we're tested. Those words hung between us, pregnant with meaning she couldn't possibly comprehend. We drove to Richard's house after breakfast, a modest craftsman on a quiet street lined with mature trees. Fall had turned the leaves golden, creating a picturesque scene that seemed too beautiful for the ugliness it contained. "I called him this morning to say I was bringing a friend by," Martha explained as we pulled into the driveway. "He's expecting someone, just not you." My heart pounded as we approached the front door. 5 years since I'd seen the man who had vowed to love me in sickness and in health. 5 years of planning for a moment I'd never been certain would come. Martha didn't knock, just used her key and called out, "Richard? We're here!" And then he was there, standing in the doorway between the living room and the hallway, a ghost of the man I'd married. Cancer had already carved away at him, leaving sunken cheeks and collarbones that protruded sharply beneath his thin t-shirt. His once thick brown hair was patchy and dull, his skin sallow, but his eyes, those green eyes I'd once loved so deeply, widened in shock when they landed on me. "Emma?" he whispered, as if saying my name too loudly might make me disappear. "Hello, Richard," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "It's been a while." He staggered slightly, reaching for the doorframe to steady himself. "Mom, what? How ... He couldn't seem to formulate a complete question. "Emma called after I told her about your diagnosis." Martha lied smoothly, protecting me. "She wanted to see you." Richard's eyes never left my face, searching for signs of anger, of hatred, finding only the careful compassion I'd arranged my features to display. "Why?" he finally managed. A loaded question. Why had I come? Why would I want to see the man who had abandoned me at my most vulnerable? Why would I extend any kindness to someone who had shown me none? "Because I understand," I said simply. "Better than most." His eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, just a moment, I almost abandoned my plan. Then I remembered how I'd felt reading his note, alone and terrified, believing I would die without ever seeing him again. And my resolve hardened once more. "I need to sit down," Richard said, his voice trembling. He turned and made his way carefully to an armchair, lowering himself with the deliberate movements of someone in constant pain. I followed him into the living room, taking in the evidence of illness everywhere, prescription bottles lined up on the coffee table, a hospital bed set up in what should have been the dining room, a wheelchair folded in the corner. Cancer had made itself at home here, just as it had in my house years ago. "You look..." Well, Richard said, his gaze taking in my healthy appearance, the weight I'd regained, the color in my cheeks, my thick hair pulled back in a ponytail. Good days and bad days, I replied cryptically. Today is a good day. He nodded, accepting this non-explanation. I don't understand why you're here, Emma. After what I did, would you prefer I leave? I asked, giving him the opportunity to reject me, knowing he wouldn't. No! The response came too quickly, too desperately. No, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I didn't say I was offering forgiveness, I pointed out gently, just understanding. Martha, sensing the tension, excused herself to make tea, leaving us alone, exactly as I'd hoped. Richard's eyes welled up again. I'm so sorry, Emma. So goddamn sorry. I was a coward. I've regretted it every day since. I sat on the couch across from him, maintaining distance while leaning forward slightly, engaged but reserved. Tell me about your diagnosis, I said, changing the subject. Mom said pancreatic? He blinked at the sudden shift but nodded. Stage 4 by the time they caught it. It had already spread to my liver. His hand moved unconsciously to his abdomen. They're trying chemo, but mainly for time, not cure. 6 months to a year, they say. I nodded, familiar with such prognoses. And how is treatment going? It's hell, he admitted, a bitter laugh escaping him. The nausea, the fatigue, and knowing it's not even going to save me, just buy a little time. I know, I said quietly, and I did know. The futility, the suffering, the bargaining with fate. Of course you do, he said, shame washing over his features. God, Emma, I left you to face all this alone. Not alone, I corrected him. My sister stayed with me. My parents visited often. Friends stepped up. I let this sink in, the contrast between his solitary suffering and the support system I'd had despite his desertion. That's good. I'm glad. He hesitated. And your treatment? How is it progressing? The careful question, the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes. He was trying to ask if I was dying without saying the words. I take each day as it comes, I said, neither confirming nor denying. Some treatments work for a while, then stop. Others have side effects too severe to continue. It's a balance. Relief flashed briefly across his face, relief that he hadn't asked directly, that I'd provided an answer that absolved him of needing to hear the brutal truth of a terminal prognosis. Maybe we can help each other through this, I suggested, planting the seed. Fellow travelers on the same difficult road. Hope brightened his tired eyes. You'd do that? After everything? I offered a small smile. Life is too short to hang on to anger, don't you think? And who better to understand what you're going through than someone walking the same path? It was manipulative, despicable even, to use his assumption of my illness as a bridge to his trust. But wasn't that exactly what my plan required? And hadn't he earned this deception through his own greater betrayal? Martha returned with tea, beaming at the apparent reconciliation taking place in her living room. We spent another hour with Richard, discussing his treatment schedule, his doctors, his daily challenges. I shared carefully edited versions of my own cancer journey, omitting the crucial detail of my remission. By the time we left, Richard had my phone number and a promise to visit again the next day. In the car, Martha squeezed my hand gratefully. You've given him such a gift, Emma. Peace before the end. If only she knew what I was actually offering. Back at her house, I begged exhaustion, another half-truth, as the emotional weight of seeing Richard had indeed drained me, and retreated to the guest room. There, I made notes about what I'd observed, his physical condition, his emotional state, the treatment regimen detailed on his medication bottles, the names of his doctors displayed on appointment cards magnetized to his refrigerator. I was building a complete picture, filling in the framework of my revenge with the specific details needed to execute it perfectly. This wasn't a hasty act of emotional retaliation. It was a precisely calculated response, years in the making, now being tailored to the exact circumstances at hand. That night, I moved to my hotel, explaining to Martha that I needed space to process the emotional reunion while assuring her I would continue visiting Richard. Alone in the anonymous room, I spread my medical records across the bed, reviewing the timeline once more. Richard had left me 3 weeks after my diagnosis. I had achieved remission 6 months later. I had been cancer-free for 4 years and 7 months. Each of these dates would become significant in the story I would gradually reveal to Richard, a story that would force him to confront the full magnitude of his abandonment. The next day, I arrived at Richard's house with groceries and a gentle knock. He opened the door looking even worse than the day before, chemotherapy taking its toll, leaving him gray-faced and trembling. "Bad day?" I asked sympathetically. He nodded weakly. "The treatment yesterday. It always hits hardest the next day." "I remember," I said, moving past him into the kitchen. I brought soup. And ginger tea. And those saltines that were the only thing I could keep down sometimes. His eyes filled with grateful tears. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," I replied simply. "Sit before you fall. I'll bring you something to try." That day established the pattern of the weeks that followed. I became Richard's primary caregiver, learning his medication schedule, accompanying him to treatments, cooking the bland foods his stomach could tolerate, cleaning his bathroom after episodes of violent illness. Martha was grateful, his doctors were impressed, and Richard was increasingly dependent, just as I had planned. I stayed in the hotel but spent most waking hours at his house. I deflected his occasional questions about my own health with vague answers and quick subject changes. I shared carefully edited stories about my life post-divorce, omitting any details that might reveal my cancer-free status. I became indispensable, irreplaceable, the angel of mercy he didn't deserve but desperately needed. And all the while, I was waiting for the perfect moment to begin my real purpose. It came 3 weeks into my stay, on an evening when Richard was having a rare good day. We sat on his back porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. He'd managed to eat half a bowl of soup and hadn't vomited in 24 hours, a victory in his diminished world. "Why did you really come, Emma?" he asked suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "The truth, not the understanding line you gave my mother." I considered deflecting again, but decided the time had come to begin the slow revelation. "I came because when I was diagnosed," I said carefully, "all I wanted was someone who understood. Not just the physical effects, but the fear, the helplessness, the rage at your own betraying body." I paused, looking directly into his eyes. "You denied me that understanding when you left. I wouldn't do the same to you." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. "So it's about showing me what real loyalty looks like? Making me feel even worse about what I did?" "No," I said, the lie smooth on my tongue. "It's about being the person I needed then. Maybe finding some healing for both of us in the process." Richard was silent for a long moment, digesting this. "How did you do it?" he finally asked. "How did you find the strength to keep fighting all these years?" "I'm only 3 months in, and some days I just want it to be over." This was my opening, the first thread of my tapestry of revelation. "When you left," I began, my voice soft but clear, "I wanted to give up. That first week I seriously considered refusing further treatment. What was the point of fighting to live when the person who was supposed to love me most couldn't even bear to watch me try?" His face crumpled in shame, exactly as I'd intended. "But then something happened," I continued. "Something unexpected." I got angry, not just at you but at cancer, at the unfairness of it all. "And I decided that I wasn't going to let either of you win." "So you fought," he whispered. "I fought," I confirmed. "Harder than I thought possible. Every time a doctor gave me bad news, every time a treatment failed, every time I spent a night vomiting alone, I pictured you believing I had died. And somehow that kept me going." It was the first hint of my true motivation, carefully disguised as inspirational determination rather than the seeds of revenge it actually was. Richard reached for my hand, his fingers cold and trembling. "I'm so glad you fought, Emma. So glad you're here now." He hesitated. "Even if it's only to show me what real courage looks like." I squeezed his hand gently, allowing him to interpret my action as forgiveness rather than the first tightening of a noose. "Rest now," I said, standing. "Big day tomorrow with the oncologist." That night in my hotel room, I updated my notes. Richard was ready for the next phase, the gradual introduction of details about my treatment success, carefully presented to maximize his guilt without yet revealing the complete truth. Over the following days, I began dropping calculated comments during our conversations. My third round of chemo was when things started to turn around. The experimental treatment protocol they tried in my second year made such a difference. Some days I almost forget I was ever sick, until a follow-up appointment reminds me. Each statement was technically true while implying continued illness. Each one made Richard more curious, more hopeful for my prognosis, more ashamed of his abandonment. And each one prepared the ground for the final revelation that would come when he was at his most vulnerable. A month into my stay, Richard's condition deteriorated significantly. The chemotherapy was failing, his cancer advancing despite treatment. His oncologist recommended transitioning to palliative care, focusing on comfort rather than increasingly futile attempts at extending life. I sat beside Richard during this consultation, holding his hand as the doctor gently explained that we were now measuring his remaining time in weeks rather than months. His mother sobbed quietly in the corner while Richard stared blankly ahead, absorbing his death sentence with a resignation that surprised me. "I think I've known for a while," he said later as I drove him home. "It never felt like I was getting better, just delaying the inevitable." I glanced at him, this hollow shell of the man I'd once loved, and felt a complicated twist of emotions. Satisfaction that my plan was approaching its climax, but also an unexpected pang of pity. "What can I do?" I asked softly. "What would make this time easier?" He was silent for so long I thought he might not answer. Then, barely audible, "Stay until the end, please." "I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway." "I'll stay," I promised, and in that moment, I meant it, though not for the reasons he imagined. As Richard entered hospice care at home, I moved from the hotel into his guest room, becoming his round-the-clock caregiver alongside the visiting nurses. Martha was grateful for the relief, exhausted from weeks of worry and help. Richard's father, Arthur, who had been largely absent during my stay, began visiting daily, his stoic exterior cracking as he watched his son fade. I administered medications, changed linens, bathed the wasting body of my ex-husband with clinical efficiency. I read to him when he was lucid, sat silently when he wasn't. I became the perfect embodiment of forgiveness and compassion. And all the while I was waiting for the perfect moment when Richard was clear-headed enough to understand, but weak enough to be unable to escape the truth I would finally deliver. It came on a clear morning in late October, 2 months after my arrival in Colorado. The hospice nurse had just left after administering Richard's morning pain medication, enough to dull his agony, but not enough to cloud his mind completely. His parents had gone to meet with the funeral director, a task Richard had insisted they handle while he was still alive to approve the arrangements. We were alone, and Richard was having one of his increasingly rare lucid periods. He lay in the hospital bed now permanently installed in his living room, sunlight streaming through the windows to illuminate his ravaged face. Despite the devastation of his disease, his eyes were clear and focused as they tracked my movements around the room. "Emma!" he called softly as I arranged his medications for the afternoon nurse. "Come sit with me." I complied, settling into the chair beside his bed, the chair I'd occupied for countless hours over the past weeks. "I need to say something," he began, his voice thin but determined. "While I still can," I nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Thank you," he said simply, "for coming back, for showing me kindness I don't deserve, for being stronger than I ever was." He reached for my hand with skeletal fingers. "I've been lying here thinking about karma, about how fitting it is that I'm dying of cancer after leaving you to face it alone." The opening I'd been waiting for had arrived. My heart pounded as I carefully composed my response. "Life is strange that way," I agreed, holding his gaze. "Full of symmetry we don't expect. I've been wondering," he continued, a slight furrow appearing between his sunken eyes, "how your treatment is going. You never really talk about it, and I've been afraid to ask." The moment had come. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what would follow. "Actually, Richard, there's something I need to tell you about that." I reached into the drawer of the side table, extracting the folder I'd placed there weeks ago, waiting for this exact conversation. "Something I've been waiting to share until you were ready to hear it." Confusion flickered across his face as I opened the folder and removed the first document, my oncologist's official declaration of remission from 4 years earlier. "What is this?" he asked, squinting at the paper I held before him. "My remission declaration?" I said calmly. "Dated October 17th, 4 years ago." His eyes widened, darting between the document and my face. "Remission? But you've been in treatment all this time." "No, Richard," I corrected gently. "I've been in remission all this time. Cancer-free for 4 years and 7 months. He stared at me, incomprehension giving way to the first dawning of understanding. "But you implied—" "I never said I was still sick," I pointed out. "I just never corrected your assumption that I was." His breathing quickened, the heart rate monitor beside his bed registering his distress with increasing beeps. Why didn't you tell me?" I extracted another document from the folder, the final scan before my remission declaration, showing the absence of cancer cells. Because I wanted you to understand exactly what you did when you left me. I don't, he began, but his voice failed him as I laid out more papers. Follow-up scans, blood work, all showing a healthy, cancer-free body. You left me to die, Richard. I continued, my voice still soft but now stripped of its false compassion. You couldn't bear to watch me suffer, to face the possibility of my death. So you ran away and left me alone with my fear and pain. Tears slid down his hollow cheeks. Emma, please. But I didn't die. I pressed on, relentless now that I'd begun. I fought. I suffered. I endured everything you couldn't bear to witness. And I survived. I'm glad, he whispered. I'm so glad you're well. Are you? I asked, arching an eyebrow. Or does it make what you did even worse? Knowing you abandoned me when I needed you most and it wasn't even necessary? That if you'd stayed, you would have had years more with a healthy wife? The monitor's beeping increased further, but I wasn't finished. Not yet. I came here, I explained, my voice now hard as steel, to make sure you understood the full consequences of your cowardice before you died. To make sure you knew that while you're withering away, I'm healthy and strong. That while you're facing death alone, as you left me to do, I'm preparing for decades more of life. You came for revenge, he managed, the word barely audible. I came for justice, I corrected. I came so you would know exactly what you threw away, what your weakness cost both of us. Richard closed his eyes, tears streaming freely now. All this time, pretending to forgive me, caring for me. Was it so different from what you did? I asked. Pretending to love me, promising in sickness and in health, then abandoning me at the first real test? At least I stayed until the end. His eyes flew open at that, shock and hurt evident in their depths. Are you leaving now? Now that you've had your revenge? I considered the question carefully. This was the moment I'd planned for, dreamed of, cultivated through weeks of careful manipulation. Richard broken, understanding at last the magnitude of his betrayal, facing his death with the knowledge of what he'd thrown away. But something unexpected had happened during these weeks of caring for him. Not forgiveness, I would never truly forgive what he'd done. But a kind of closure I hadn't anticipated, a releasing of the poison his abandonment had planted in me. No, I finally answered. I promised to stay until the end and I will. But now you'll spend your final days knowing the truth. Knowing that your suffering could have been shared, your burden lightened by a wife who survived what you couldn't face. Relief washed over his features, followed immediately by a deeper anguish. I don't deserve your presence. No, I agreed. You don't. But unlike you, I keep my promises. I replaced the medical documents in the folder and returned it to the drawer. The revelation was complete. The truth was laid bare between us. Whatever came next, whether days or weeks remained for Richard, would be colored by this knowledge, this understanding of what might have been. Richard reached for my hand again, and after a moment's hesitation, I allowed the contact. I loved you, he whispered. Even when I left, I just wasn't strong enough to watch you suffer. And I loved you, I admitted. Enough to want you to fully understand what you did before you die. We sat in silence then, his labored breathing and the steady beep of the monitor the only sounds in the room. Outside, leaves fell from trees in a gentle cascade of gold and crimson, nature's reminder that endings can be beautiful even in their finality. What happens now? Richard finally asked. I looked at the man I had once built my life around, now reduced to bones and regret, and felt the last of my anger transform into something less consuming, less destructive. Now we wait, I said simply. Together, as we should have done 5 years ago. And so we did. The truth between us at last. The days that followed my revelation unfolded in a strange new reality. The pretense had fallen away, leaving us in an unfamiliar territory of brutal honesty. Richard didn't mention my deception again directly, but I could see the knowledge of it lingering in his eyes whenever they met mine, a mixture of hurt, shame, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Perhaps understanding. Martha and Arthur noticed the shift between us, but attributed it to Richard's declining condition rather than any dramatic revelation. I continued to administer medications, change sheets, prepare what little food Richard could still tolerate. But now, these acts of care were performed in a vacuum of pretense. We both knew exactly what I was doing and why. You don't have to keep bathing me, Richard said one morning as I prepared the washcloths and basin. His voice was weaker now, a whisper of its former self. You've made your point. I wrung out the cloth, the water warm between my fingers. This isn't about making a point anymore. Then what is it about? His sunken eyes searched my face for answers I wasn't sure I had. I considered the question as I gently washed his arm, the skin loose over bones that seemed more prominent each day. Why was I still here now that my revenge was complete? Now that he understood exactly what he had thrown away? Finishing what I started, I finally replied, "Seeing things through to the end?" He accepted this with a slight nod, too weak to press further. But the question lingered between us, demanding an answer I wasn't ready to give, perhaps not even to myself. That evening, after Richard had fallen into a fitful sleep, Martha cornered me in the kitchen where I was preparing tomorrow's medications. "Something's changed," she said bluntly, her gray eyes, so like Richard's once were, fixed on my face. "Between you and Richard, did he say something to upset you?" I arranged pills in the daily dispenser, buying time. "Nothing's changed, Martha. We're just both aware that time is running short." She studied me for a long moment, unconvinced. "You know, when you first arrived, I thought it was a miracle. That you'd found it in your heart to forgive him after what he did." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Now I'm not so sure forgiveness was what brought you here." My hands stilled over the medication. Martha was more perceptive than I'd given her credit for. "Does it matter why I came as long as I'm here now?" "I suppose not," she conceded. "But Richard deserves peace in his final days. Whatever is happening between you two, please don't let it rob him of that." I met her gaze directly. "I'm not the one who robbed Richard of peace, Martha. He made that choice 5 years ago." Her face fell, the brief flash of maternal protectiveness fading into resigned acceptance. Yes, he did." She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Just remember, Emma, whatever he did to you, you're doing to yourself as well by carrying it." Her words followed me through the quiet house that night as I checked on Richard hourly, adjusting his oxygen, administering the midnight dose of morphine. Was I hurting myself by seeing this through? Had my revelation brought me the closure I'd sought for so long? Richard's breathing was labored now, a ragged sound that filled the darkened living room. The hospice nurse had warned us that pneumonia was setting in, a common end-stage complication. Soon the battle would be over, one way or another. I sat in the chair beside his bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest. 5 years ago, I had imagined this moment differently. In my darkest thoughts, I had pictured telling Richard the truth and then walking away, leaving him to die with the knowledge of what he'd lost. A perfect symmetry to his abandonment of me. But now, sitting in the dim light of his living room, listening to the struggle of each breath, I couldn't imagine leaving. Not because I'd forgiven him, but because something in me needed to see this journey through to its conclusion, to bear witness to the end I had once faced alone. "Em?" Richard's voice, barely audible, broke through my thoughts. His eyes were open, clearer than they'd been in days. One of those strange rallies that sometimes come near the end, a final flaring of consciousness before the light goes out. "I'm here," I replied, leaning forward so he could see me without straining. "Need to ask you something." Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort. "The truth, please." I nodded, bracing myself. "What is it?" "If I hadn't gotten sick." He paused, gathering strength. "Would you ever have told me?" "About your remission?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on executing my plan that I'd never considered what might have happened if fate hadn't handed me the perfect opportunity. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'd like to think I would have moved on completely, left the past behind. But truthfully, I think I would have found a way to tell you eventually. The need for you to understand what you did. It was too strong to ignore forever." He absorbed this, his eyes never leaving my face. "So my cancer was convenient?" "Yes," I said, not flinching from the truth. "It was—" A sound escaped him, something between a laugh and a sob. "Karma's a bitch." "Richard, no, it's okay." He lifted a skeletal hand, letting it fall weakly back to the blanket. "I deserve it. All of it." His gaze drifted to the ceiling. "You know what the worst part is?" I waited, saying nothing. "Not that I missed years with you. Not even that I have to die knowing you're healthy and will live on without me." His eyes found mine again. "It's that I'll never know if I could have been brave enough to stay. If I could have been the man you deserved." Something shifted in my chest at his words. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but a recognition of the tragedy of it all. The waste. The unnecessary loss. "You could have been," I said softly. "That's what makes what you did so unforgivable. You chose the easier path." "Yes." No denial, no excuse. Just simple acknowledgement. "I did." We sat in silence after that, the truth naked between us. Eventually, his eyes closed again, exhaustion pulling him back under. I remained in the chair, watching over him until dawn broke. The next morning, the hospice nurse confirmed what we already knew. The end was imminent. Hours, perhaps a day at most. Richard's systems were shutting down one by one, his body too weak to fight the pneumonia that had taken hold in his lungs. Martha and Arthur took up residence in the living room, keeping vigil alongside me. Friends came and went throughout the day. College colleagues, neighbors, a few distant relatives. All of them greeted me with surprise and tentative warmth, having heard some version of our story, but never expecting to find me at Richard's deathbed. "You're a better person than most," one of his colleagues murmured as she prepared to leave. After what he did? I smiled tightly, not bothering to correct her assumption. Let them think what they wanted. The truth was between Richard and me alone. As night fell, the stream of visitors thinned, then stopped altogether. The house grew quiet except for the hiss of the oxygen machine and Richard's increasingly labored breathing. Martha and Arthur had retreated to the guest room at my insistence, promising to call them if there was any change. I sat alone with Richard, the man I had once loved enough to promise forever, the man who had broken that promise at the first real test. The man whose death I had once anticipated with vengeful satisfaction, but now viewed with complex emotion. "Water," he rasped suddenly, startling me. I hadn't realized he was conscious. I held the straw to his cracked lips, supporting his head as he took a small sip. His eyes opened, finding mine in the dim light. "Thank you," he whispered. "For staying." I set the cup aside. "I told you I would, not just that." He swallowed with visible effort. "For making me understand. Before—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I took his hand, the bones bird-like beneath my fingers. "I wanted to hate you," I admitted. "For 5 years I nurtured that hatred, planned for this moment. But now that it's here I just feel tired." It was the truth, surprising even me as I spoke it. "Tired of carrying the weight of what you did. Tired of letting it define me." His fingers twitched against mine, an attempt to squeeze my hand. "I'm sorry, Emma." "So sorry." "I know," I said quietly. "I believe you are, but it doesn't change what happened." "No," he agreed. "Nothing can." We lapsed into silence again, the only sound his ragged breathing and the steady beep of the heart monitor. Minutes stretched into hours. Richard drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words I couldn't catch. I maintained my vigil, occasionally moistening his lips or adjusting his position for comfort. Around 3 a.m, his eyes opened fully, startlingly lucid. "Emma," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "One last thing." I leaned closer. "What is it?" "After I'm gone?" He paused, gathering strength. "Don't let this, what I did, what you did, be the end of your story." I frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean?" "The revenge. The waiting. The years spent focused on making me understand." His eyes held mine intently. "It's done now. Let it be done. Don't carry it forward." Something tight and painful unwound in my chest. "Are you forgiving me?" The irony wasn't lost on me, seeking forgiveness from the man I'd come to punish. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Maybe we can forgive each other. Too late for us, but not too late for you." Tears pricked at my eyes, the first I'd shed since coming to Colorado, not for the man he had been or what he had done to me, but for the waste of it all. The poisonous years spent nurturing hatred instead of healing. The symmetrical tragedy of his abandonment and my revenge. "I'll try," I whispered and meant it. Richard nodded slightly, seemingly satisfied. His eyes closed again, his breathing growing more labored. I continued to hold his hand, offering what comfort I could as he journeyed toward the threshold I had once approached but not crossed. Martha and Arthur joined me around dawn, summoned by some instinct that told them time was short. We sat together in the pale morning light, witnessing Richard's final struggle. His parents cried quietly, their hands clasped tightly together. I remained dry-eyed but present, completing the circle of what had begun 5 years earlier when he had walked away. At 7:42 a.m., Richard drew a final, shuddering breath and was still. The room fell silent, the absence of his labored breathing more deafening than any sound had been. "He's gone," Martha whispered unnecessarily. I released Richard's hand, laying it gently on his chest. "Yes," I agreed. "He's gone." The rituals that follow death are universal, transcending the particular circumstances that lead to the end. The hospice nurse was called, arriving promptly to pronounce what we already knew. The funeral home was notified, men in somber suits arriving to take Richard's body away. Forms were signed, arrangements confirmed, phone calls made to distant relatives and friends. Through it all, I moved as if in a dream, performing the tasks expected of the primary caregiver. Martha and Arthur seemed to accept my continued presence without question, grateful for my efficiency in handling details they were too grief-stricken to manage. It wasn't until late that afternoon, when Richard's body was gone and the house fell into an exhausted hush, that I finally retreated to the guest room and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had transpired. I had come to Colorado seeking revenge, carrying 5 years of carefully nurtured hatred and plans for a perfect symmetrical justice. I had executed that plan flawlessly, forcing Richard to confront the magnitude of his abandonment before he died. And yet, the satisfaction I had anticipated, the sense of completion and vindication, remained elusive. Instead, I felt hollowed out, scraped clean of the poison that had sustained me for so long. Not healed, the scar of what Richard had done would always remain, but no longer infected by it. I lay on the guest bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried to identify what I was feeling. Not regret for coming, not exactly. Not forgiveness for what Richard had done, but something else. A recognition that in the end, we had both lost. He had lost years he could have had with me. I had lost years I could have spent living fully instead of plotting revenge. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane, checking in as she had daily since I'd arrived in Colorado. "Is it over?" she asked simply. "Yes," I replied. "This morning. How do you feel?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "Empty. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Coming home soon?" Home. The word struck me with unexpected force. What was home now? The house I'd maintained all these years, keeping it as a shrine to what Richard had destroyed? The life I'd built around the absence of the future we'd planned? "Soon," I texted back. But not quite yet. I attended Richard's funeral 3 days later, standing quietly beside Martha and Arthur as friends and colleagues offered condolences. Many expressed surprise at my presence, their whispered comments reaching me despite attempts at discretion. "Can you believe his ex-wife is here? After he left her during cancer treatment. I heard she never remarried. Must have really loved him despite everything. Such forgiveness. I could never, if only they knew the truth. But that would remain between Richard and me. Our secret, buried with him." The eulogy was delivered by a colleague from the college, highlighting Richard's academic achievements and dedication to his students. No mention was made of his personal failings, his abandonment of his cancer-stricken wife. Death, as it often does, had sanitized his story. I didn't speak at the service, though Martha had offered me the opportunity. What could I possibly say that wouldn't be either a lie or inappropriately revealing? Instead, I placed a single white rose on his casket as it was lowered into the ground, a symbol not of forgiveness but of completion. The circle closed. The story ended. After the burial, a reception was held at Richard's house, now technically belonging to his parents as his sole heirs. I moved through the rooms that had become familiar during my weeks of caregiving, accepting condolences with murmured thanks, deflecting questions about my own health with practiced vagueness. "Will you stay in touch?" Martha asked as the last guests were leaving, her face lined with fresh grief. "After you go back home?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. The purpose that had brought me here was fulfilled. The connection that had bound me to this family was severed. "I'm not sure that would be healthy," I said gently. "For any of us." She nodded, understanding despite her disappointment. "You did more than he deserved coming here at all. We know that. It wasn't entirely selfless," I admitted, offering her this small truth among the larger ones I withheld. "Nothing ever is," she replied with unexpected wisdom. "But you were here when it mattered. That counts for something." I embraced her then, this woman who might have been my mother-in-law for decades in another life. "Take care of yourself, Martha. You too, Emma. And remember what I said. Don't carry this weight forward. Whatever happened between you and Richard, let it rest with him." Her words echoed Richard's final request so closely that I pulled back in surprise. "Did he say something to you?" She shook her head. "No. But I saw something change between you in those final days. Something important." I nodded, unable to explain but grateful for her perception. "Goodbye, Martha." "Goodbye, dear." The next morning, I packed my suitcases, loading them into the rental car I'd maintained throughout my stay. The medical records that had been my evidence and ammunition remained in the side table drawer, a deliberate leaving behind. Let Martha find them if she went through Richard's things. Let her understand, or not, what had truly transpired in her son's final days. Before leaving town, I drove to a small park overlooking the mountains Richard had chosen as his final landscape. I sat on a bench, watching the early November sun cast long shadows across the golden grasses. My phone rang. Diane again, checking in. "Just left Richard's house," I told her. "Heading to the airport in a few hours." "How are you really doing?" she asked, her voice filled with the concern that had sustained me during my illness. I considered the question, watching an eagle circle lazily above the foothills. "I'm not sure yet," I answered honestly. "I came here for a specific purpose, and I accomplished it. But I don't feel what I expected to feel." Which was vindicated. Satisfied? Whole again. I sighed. "Instead, I just feel ready to move on." "That's something," Diane offered. "Better than being stuck where you were." "Yes," I agreed. "Better than that." We talked for a few more minutes about practical matters, my flight details, arrangements for picking me up, plans for my return to teaching after my leave of absence. The ordinary scaffolding of life that continues regardless of personal drama. After hanging up, I remained on the bench, reflecting on the past 2 months. I had come to Colorado as an avenging angel, determined to make Richard understand exactly what he had thrown away. I had succeeded in that goal, revealing my remission at the perfect moment to maximize his regret and pain. But somewhere along the way, between changing soiled bedsheets and administering pain medication and sitting vigil through long nights, the sharp edges of my hatred had worn smooth. Not because Richard deserved forgiveness. He didn't, and I hadn't truly granted it. But because carrying that hatred had become more painful than releasing it. A young couple walked past, hand in hand, laughing at some private joke. I watched them, remembering when Richard and I had been like that, young, in love, believing our commitment was unbreakable, before cancer had revealed the true nature of his love, before abandonment had revealed the true nature of mine. Richard's final words echoed in my mind. "Don't let this be the end of your story." He was right about that much, at least. The story of Richard's betrayal and my revenge had consumed 5 years of my life, years I could never get back. Cancer had tried to take my future. I had survived. Richard had tried to take my trust. I had survived that too. But I had allowed the pursuit of revenge to take my present, to hold me in a limbo of waiting and planning rather than truly living. No more. I stood, taking one last look at the mountains Richard had chosen as his final view. Then I turned my back on them and walked to my car. It was time to go home, not to the shrine of betrayal I'd maintained all these years, but to whatever came next. The flight back was uneventful, hours of suspended animation between the life I'd temporarily inhabited and the one waiting for me. I closed my eyes, not sleeping but not fully awake either, floating in the liminal space that seemed to match my emotional state. Diane met me at the airport, wrapping me in a fierce hug before holding me at arm's length to study my face. "You look different," she observed as we walked to the parking garage. "Different how?" She considered this as she loaded my suitcases into her trunk. "Lighter somehow. Less haunted." I smiled faintly. "That's probably accurate." "So it worked?" she asked, sliding into the driver's seat. "Your whole revenge plan? Getting him to know you survived?" I buckled my seatbelt, watching the airport recede in the side mirror. Yes and no. He knew. He understood. He regretted everything before he died. But it didn't feel the way I expected. In the end, we were just two people who had hurt each other. Him by leaving, me by waiting until he was dying to tell him the truth. Diane drove in silence for a while, processing this. "Do you regret going?" I gazed out the window at the familiar streets of home, seeing them with new eyes after my absence. No, I needed to finish it, to close that chapter decisively. I turned to her. "But I won't be defined by it anymore." She reached across the console to squeeze my hand. "Good. It's about damn time." The house was exactly as I'd left it 2 months earlier, clean, ordered, unchanged. The graduate student who'd been subletting had moved out the day before, leaving everything pristine. I walked through the rooms slowly, seeing them with fresh perspective. So many things I'd kept as they were when Richard left. Photographs I hadn't updated, spaces I hadn't redesigned, possessions I'd maintained out of some misguided belief that preserving the scene of his crime would somehow make my revenge more complete when it finally came. Standing in the master bedroom, looking at the king-sized bed we'd chosen together during happier times, I made a decision. Tomorrow I would begin transforming this shrine to betrayal into something new. A home for the next chapter, not a museum for the last one. That evening I called Thomas. The kind man I'd dated briefly before my trip to Colorado, the one I'd pushed away when he'd started talking about future plans. "Emma?" His voice held surprise and pleasure. "How are you?" "I'm back," I said simply. "From Colorado. And I was wondering if you might want to have dinner sometime. To talk." "I'd like that," he replied without hesitation. "Very much." We made plans for the following weekend, the conversation easy and unforced. I didn't explain about Richard or my trip. That would come later if Thomas and I moved forward. But for the first time, I believed I might actually be capable of sharing that story without it overtaking everything else. The next day, I began the transformation. I hired a local charity to collect the furniture Richard and I had purchased together, the bed, the dining set, the living room sofa. I took down photographs, packed away mementos, cleared spaces that had remained unchanged since his departure. Not erasing him, that would be another form of denial, but releasing the physical anchors that had held me to that painful past. My sister arrived unannounced that afternoon, finding me amid boxes and empty spaces. "Whoa," she said, surveying the half-dismantled living room. "When you said you were moving on, you weren't kidding." I smiled, wiping dust from my hands. "It's overdue." She nodded, then picked up a box. "Where do you want this?" Together we worked through the house, sorting, discarding, reorganizing. By evening, the physical transformation had begun to mirror the internal one. Not complete, not perfect, but unmistakably in progress. Over takeout Thai food on the floor of my newly empty dining room, Diane finally asked the question she'd been holding back. "Are you really okay, Em? After everything with Richard?" I twirled noodles around my fork, considering. "I think I'm getting there." For 5 years, I defined myself by what he did to me and what I planned to do in return. Now that it's done, I'm figuring out who I am without that defining me. "And who is that?" she asked softly. "I'm not entirely sure yet," I admitted, "but I'm looking forward to finding out." She raised her beer bottle in a toast. "To finding out." I clinked my bottle against hers. "To finding out." That night, sleeping on a mattress on the floor of what would become a guest room rather than the master bedroom Richard and I had shared, I dreamed of him for the first time since his death. Not the skeletal, cancer-ravaged Richard of his final days, but the man I had married, healthy, smiling, his green eyes bright with the love I had once believed would last forever. In the dream, we stood facing each other in a featureless white space, neither heaven nor earth, just elsewhere. "You did it," Dream Richard said, his voice strong again. "You made me understand." "Yes," I agreed. "I did. Was it worth it? The years of waiting? The planning?" I considered this, able to be honest in the way dreams sometimes allow. "No. But I needed to do it anyway." He nodded, unsurprised. "What will you do now?" "Live," I said simply. "Not for revenge. Not in spite of you. Just live." "Good." He smiled, a genuine expression I hadn't seen in years. "That's what I wanted for you in the end." "I know." He began to fade then, the edges of his form becoming indistinct. "Goodbye, Emma." "Goodbye, Richard." I woke with tears on my cheeks, but a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt since before the word cancer had entered our vocabulary. Not healed, that would take more time, but healing. Not free of the past, but no longer imprisoned by it. The following weeks unfolded in a rhythm of renewal and rediscovery. I returned to teaching, my students' energy and optimism a daily reminder of life's forward momentum. I chose new furniture, painted walls in colors Richard would have hated, planted a garden though autumn was well underway, preparing for spring, for growth yet to come. My date with Thomas was comfortable, honest. I told him a simplified version of my trip to Colorado, explaining that I had needed closure with my ex-husband before his death. "That must have been difficult," Thomas observed, his kind eyes searching mine across the restaurant table. "Being there at the end after what he did to you." "It was," I agreed, "but necessary. For both of us, I think." "And now?" he asked carefully, hope and hesitation mingled in his voice. I smiled, reaching for his hand. "Now I'm ready to see what comes next. If you're still interested." His fingers interlaced with mine. "I am, very much so." We took things slowly, dinner dates, weekend hikes, movies on my new sofa. Thomas never pushed for more than I was ready to give, understanding intuitively that I was rebuilding myself alongside my home. When he finally spent the night, 3 months after my return from Colorado, it was in a bedroom that bore no trace of Richard's presence, a space that belonged only to me, and now, tentatively, to this new connection. 6 months after Richard's death, I received a package in the mail, a small box with a Colorado return address, Martha's handwriting. Inside was a simple silver frame containing a photograph I'd never seen before, Richard and me on our wedding day, faces alight with joy and promise, caught in a moment of laughter as we cut the cake. A note accompanied it. Found this while cleaning out Richard's office. Thought you might want it, not as a reminder of what was lost, but of what was real before everything else happened. With love, Martha. I sat at my kitchen table, a new table in a kitchen painted a warm yellow instead of the neutral beige Richard had preferred, and studied the photograph. The young woman with the radiant smile, the man looking at her as if she were the center of his universe. They had existed once, those versions of ourselves. The love had been real before it was tested and found wanting. The promises had been sincere before they were broken. For a moment I considered returning the photograph to Martha, or perhaps discarding it. It didn't fit with my newly redesigned life, my carefully curated present that faced forward rather than back. Instead, I placed it on a bookshelf in my study, not prominently displayed but not hidden either. An acknowledgement of history rather than a shrine to it. A chapter in my story, but not the whole book. That evening, I called Martha, the first contact since I'd left Colorado. "Thank you for the photograph," I said when she answered, her surprise at hearing my voice evident in her sharp intake of breath. "You're welcome," she replied after a moment. "I wasn't sure if you'd want it." "I wasn't either," I admitted, "but I'm glad to have it." We talked for a while then, about her grief, about Arthur's health issues, about the memorial scholarship they'd established in Richard's name at the college, about my house renovations, my return to teaching, my tentative new relationship. Careful topics, navigating the complicated geography of our connection. As we prepared to end the call, Martha said something that caught me off guard. "I found the medical records, Emma. In Richard's bedside table." My breath caught. "I see. I understand now," she continued softly. "What happened between you two at the end? Why you really came?" I closed my eyes, unsure how to respond. "Martha—" "No, it's all right," she interrupted. "I'm not judging you. After what he did. Well, I might have done the same in your position. Does it change how you feel about my being there?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she finally said. "You were there when he needed someone most. Whatever your reasons, that matters. And I think in some way it helped Richard make peace with himself before the end." "I hope so," I said, meaning it. "Despite everything, I hope he found some peace." After we hung up, I went for a long walk through my neighborhood, processing this unexpected revelation. Martha knew the truth, and she didn't hate me for it. The secret Richard and I had shared was a secret no longer, yet somehow that felt right. A final unburdening, a last release of the weight I'd carried for so long. Spring arrived, a full year since my cancer diagnosis and Richard's abandonment. The garden I'd planted in autumn defiance of seasonal norms was blooming, daffodils, crocuses, early tulips pushing through soil still cool from winter's retreat. Thomas had gradually moved more of his belongings into my renovated home, though we maintained his apartment as a separate space, neither of us quite ready for complete merging. We were building something careful and intentional, mindful of the scars we both carried from previous heartbreaks. I continued my regular checkups with Dr. Mitchell, each clean scan another milestone of survival, not just of cancer, but of all that had followed. 5 years cancer-free was approaching, the magical mark oncologists consider the closest thing to a cure. "Any plans to celebrate the 5-year mark?" Dr. Mitchell asked during my April appointment, reviewing my latest blood work with evident satisfaction. I thought about it, suddenly realizing I hadn't planned anything. In previous years, the anniversary of my remission had been overshadowed by my revenge planning, the date significant only as a marker in my elaborate timeline of deception. "Actually, I hadn't thought about it," I admitted. "But maybe I should." She smiled, closing my file. "You should definitely mark the occasion. 5 years is a big deal, Emma. Most people don't get there after a diagnosis as serious as yours." "You're right," I agreed. "I'll plan something special." That evening, I mentioned the conversation to Thomas as we prepared dinner together in our kitchen. 5 years cancer-free? He mused, chopping vegetables with precise, even cuts. That definitely calls for a celebration. What would you like to do? I leaned against the counter, considering. I'm not sure. In the past, I never really celebrated my remission anniversaries. They always felt complicated. He set down the knife, giving me his full attention. Because of Richard? I nodded. Thomas knew the full story now. About my illness, Richard's abandonment, my years of waiting, my trip to Colorado, the revenge that had brought less satisfaction than expected. He had listened without judgment, understanding it as part of what had shaped me into the woman he was coming to love. Maybe it's time to reclaim that date, he suggested gently. Make it about your survival, your strength, not about him or what he did. You're right, I said, the idea taking root. Completely right. And so, when October 17th arrived, 5 years to the day since Dr. Mitchell had declared me in remission, I celebrated. Not with a massive party or elaborate event, but with a small gathering of the people who had truly supported me through both cancer and its aftermath. Diane and her husband, my parents, a few close friends who had shown up consistently during my illness. Thomas, now officially living with me, his books mingled with mine on shelves, his clothes hanging beside mine in the closet, and somewhat surprisingly, Martha and Arthur, who had accepted my invitation with grateful tears over the phone. We gathered in my backyard, transformed by Thomas's landscaping skills and my newfound gardening passion into an autumn oasis of mums and ornamental grasses. I'd hired a caterer, splurging on excellent food and wine. No hospital green decorations, no cancer survivor themes, just beautiful tables under string lights, excellent company, and the simple joy of being alive to experience it all. After dinner, as twilight softened the edges of the yard and the first stars appeared, I stood to offer a toast. 5 years ago today, I began, my voice steady as I looked around at the faces of those I loved. I was given news I'd been desperate to hear, that the cancer was gone, that I would live. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate what that meant, because I was still focused on what I'd lost rather than what I'd gained. Thomas squeezed my hand encouragingly. The past 5 years have been a journey, I continued. Not always a healthy one, not always one I'm proud of. But standing here now, looking at all of you who supported me through the worst and stayed for the after, I paused, emotion threatening to overcome me. I can finally say that I'm not just cancer-free. I'm free. Glasses raised around the table, faces shining with love and understanding. Even Martha and Arthur, who knew better than most the complicated path that had led to this moment. To freedom, Thomas said, his eyes holding mine. And to many more years of it. To freedom, everyone echoed. Later, after all the guests had gone except Thomas, we sat together on the porch swing, wrapped in blankets against the October chill. Happy anniversary, he murmured, his arm warm around my shoulders. Thank you, I replied, leaning into his solid presence. For everything. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars brighten in the darkening sky. I thought about the journey of the past 5 years, from diagnosis to abandonment to revenge to this unexpected peace. I've been thinking, Thomas said eventually, about what you said in your toast. About being free, I was wondering. He shifted slightly, turning to face me. If you might consider taking on a different kind of commitment, one chosen freely with open eyes. My heart quickened as he reached into his pocket and extracted a small velvet box. Thomas, I'm not Richard, he said quietly. And you're not the woman you were when you married him. We've both been through enough to know that nothing is guaranteed. Not health, not happiness, not forever. But I want to try for those things with you, Emma, for as long as we have. He opened the box, revealing a simple sapphire ring, not a diamond, nothing that would echo my first engagement. What do you say? Want to build something new together? I looked at the ring, at his hopeful face, at the life we'd begun creating in the house that was no longer a shrine to betrayal. Richard's final words echoed in my mind. Don't let this be the end of your story. It wasn't. It was only a chapter. Important, defining, but not the whole narrative. Yes, I said, joy bubbling up from a place I'd thought long dead. Yes, I would like that very much. As Thomas slipped the ring onto my finger, a perfect fit, of course he would have made sure of that, I felt the final weight of the past lift away. Not forgotten, never that, but no longer controlling. no longer the lens through which I viewed every present moment and future possibility. My husband had abandoned me when I had cancer. On his deathbed, I had revealed I'd been cancer-free for years. Both of these things had happened. Both had shaped me. Both were true. But they weren't the whole truth. The whole truth was larger, more complex, more hopeful, a story still being written, one day at a time, in freedom and mindful choice. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, noting my momentary introspection. I smiled, leaning forward to kiss him gently. That I'm ready for the next chapter, and I was